Well, hello there. Today's weapon of rat destruction, overfitting. Have you ever watched a neighborhood meeting erupt in anger as residents point fingers at that group, convinced they're the perennial source of problems? Imagine if for decades reports dating back to 1994 singled out one group as the main problem. But then, in recent years, arrests and investigations told a very different story, one in which the offenders come from the formerly blameless other side of the aisle. Yet, no matter how many new incidents involve the formerly blameless, the old narrative remains untouched, defended as if it were an unfalsifiable law of nature. Worse still, many of these new criminals are citing the long standing data as justification for any crimes currently being committed. They claim the other side had it coming. Overfitting, in its original statistical sense, describes a model so tightly tuned to its training data that it makes random noise sound like a genuine signal. In human systems, whether bureaucratic procedures, organizational best practices, or personal heuristics, overfitting occurs when decision makers cling to legacy rules long after the underlying conditions have changed. What once served as sound evidence becomes stale, yet it remains unchallenged because it's familiar. The ActFoE core heuristic asks, what concrete data or shared norm justifies this step? In many overfitted processes, the answer defaults to the memory of past success rather than fresh validation. Malicious overfitting looks very different from its negligent cousin. In the former, actors deploy debate tactics, never apologizing, never admitting error, to shield flawed reasoning behind rhetorical shields. They weaponize authority and parliamentary maneuvers to silence critique, treating dissent as a procedural threat rather than a corrective signal. That pattern belongs to adversarial negotiation or formalized debate, where the goal is to win at all costs, not necessarily to find the truth or common ground. This video, however, focuses on the negligence adjacent form of overfitting. Individuals and institutions unknowingly motivated by a third factor, such as a cultural script, a hidden bias, or organizational inertia. Even here, authority can be invoked reflexively. This is our policy to stifle challenges. By isolating that third factor and rerunning our decisions through the Qualitative Reference Protocol, we can begin to expose and correct these silent failures without falling into cynicism or nihilism. When overfitting infects human systems, it doesn't look like outright deceit, but more like confident inertia. Teams continue to apply checklists and protocols that once performed flawlessly, even as the environment shifts beneath their feet. The core heuristic, what concrete data or shared norm justifies this step, goes unanswered. Yet the process remains sacrosanct. Decision makers assume that procedural fidelity equals evidence, never pausing to ask whether yesterday's fit still holds today. Beneath this inertia lies a third factor driving the persistence, perhaps organizational culture, unexamined bias, or a hidden comfort with familiarity. Actors rarely recognize this motivator, They simply treat policy as immutable authority. Formal parliamentary tactics like lengthy committee referrals, rulebook citations, round after round readings become default tools to sideline any challenge. More informally, a common tactic is to label someone an ad hominem and thereby disqualify them from having an opinion and perhaps terrifying them from having one again in the future. Dissent isn't engaged on its merits, but deferred or drowned in procedural noise, as if stifling questions preserve stability. Cognitive shortcuts intensify the problem. Given change, leaders fail to seek fresh data points when conditions evolve. Under complexity, they cling to broad generalizations instead of testing new scenarios. And under uncertainty, the discomfort of the unknown makes the old model feel safer than a rapid pilot study. These microchecks never flag a failure because the system was never revalidated against the new reality. What looks like careful deliberation is in fact a reflexive repetition of outdated fits. As these unfit procedures silently accumulate errors, frustration mounts. Stakeholders blame the system's complexity or conclude that evidence itself is unreliable, edging toward the nihilistic thought, why bother, or why are you noticing? This is the moment when overfitting threatens meaning and purpose, calling into question a reality everyone can see happening, but that those in power pretend is a lie or tactic of their enemies. Without recognizing and isolating the third factor, organizations loop deeper into trial and repeat rather than test and adapt, perfectly illustrating how negligence-adjacent overfitting widens evidence gaps while masquerading as diligence. To correct negligence-adjacent overfitting, we can use ActFoE's cured heuristic. First, we isolate the elusive third factor to the Qualitative Reference Protocol. This process begins by naming the missing value, whether adaptability, fairness, or trust, that hides behind the unquestioned procedures. With that value identified, we craft a concise test question, such as, does this policy still deliver the results we need today? Replaying the proposed action against the question instantly reveals whether a hidden motivator has steered the decision, exposing the third factor that sustained the misfit. For example, if the old group of troublemakers are the current troublemakers, then a cost examination of damages should give an idea of whether or not the old policy still holds. By contrast, if the crimes perpetuated are significantly tilted the opposite direction, the other people on the other side of the aisle who used to be blameless, well then, the old model must be discarded. Second, an appropriate examination of the new conditions should be examined. So deploy a targeted bias guard, microchecks, and key procedural triggers, the specifics of which would need to be negotiated. So I'm going to skip that. But in general, look to isolate whether the problem is the result of change, complexity, and or uncertainty. And then proceed, appropriately. Third, we engage the norm trigger matrix to renew shared heuristics. So the rule of law test asks whether the updated standard is applied impartially or whether legacy exceptions persist. Anything for me and my friends, for everyone else, the law. The forgiveness of debts test invites an honest acknowledgement of past fits that no longer serve, making room for course correction. So if the data says, hey, it's a different group of people, well then your policy should take care of that different group of people, using legal means. And finally, The hospitality test challenges the team to extend goodwill by inviting outside critique, rotating reviewers, or opening a public comment period, something along those lines. Assuming, of course, you're not dealing with an entrenched enemy who will simply use these as an opportunity to get a photo op, making you look bad. But hey, I never said this process was perfect. Anyhow, the idea is to make the change feel communal rather than imposed. Cycling through these norms re-anchors the decision process in values that transcend particular teams and cultures, transforming adaptation from a private habit into a shared responsibility. A thing that in theory you wouldn't have to do if people weren't chipping away at all of our norms. Anyhow, preventing overfitting driven inertia is deceptively difficult. From decades of groupthink research, we know that any rule designed to curb uniformity can be co-opted to entrench it. A charter encouraging opinions becomes the very mechanism that silences criticism. A committee meant to inject fresh perspective instead convenes only loyalists. In confronting overfitting, we face a similar paradox. The safeguards we build against stale procedures can be twisted into new forms of lockstep orthodoxy. Tackling this challenge feels less like a straightforward reform and more like launching a high-risk startup. Success rates are low, uncertainty is high, and the path forward resists scaling. In my experience, the single most reliable predictor of progress is securing at least one ally with genuine influence. An advocate in leadership can open doors, protect pilot programs, and model the adaptive behavior you seek. If you can't win over that first collaborator, you're not yet equipped to shift the system, and it may be wiser to refine your approach before pressing on. In conclusion, overfitting emerges when any model or procedure becomes so tightly tuned to its original data that it mistakes historical quirks for universal truths. In human systems, this shows up as stale checklists, entrenched policies, and reflexive authority tactics that silence fresh evidence and dissent. Throughout this video, we've seen how negligence adjacent overfitting is driven by hidden third factors rather than by ill intent, and how ActFoE protocols can expose these blind spots. By isolating missing values, running bias guard micro-checks, and cycling through shared norms, organizations can replace rote fidelity with adaptive rigor. And with that, I wish you good luck confronting the problem of overfitting.